Picture a city so obsessed with death that it turned grief into a profession. Now fill it with 36,000 funerals a year. Add black horses wearing black velvet headdresses with plumes that shiver in the November wind. Add crepe on every door knocker of every house where someone has recently died, the cloth draped there like a flag of surrender. Add black bordered envelopes, black-edged handkerchiefs, black dresses worn for a minimum of 2 years after losing a husband, 1 year after a parent, 6 months after a sibling, or society considered you indecent. Add a queen who has worn nothing but black for over a decade and shows no signs of stopping. Add women paid by the hour to cry at strangers' graves. That's London. That's 1872. A city where death is not a pause in commerce. It's where commerce puts on its most elaborate costume and charges by the yard. We're going back there tonight. Not as bystanders watching a funeral procession cross the street ahead of you. We're living it. One winter, one woman. Everything she would have touched, worn, endured, and performed for money she desperately needed. So, I make these history stories, and honestly, I have no idea if you're listening because you want to fall asleep, or because you have a genuinely strange interest in the Victorian grief industry that you keep very quiet about at dinner parties. Either way, here you are, and here we go. Get comfortable. Pull something over you. Here we go. The crying starts in your chest. That's the trick of it, and it took you 3 weeks to learn it properly. Not the eyes first, not the throat, the chest. You press your fist against your sternum just lightly, just enough to feel your own ribs through the thick black wool, and you let the breath catch there. 1 count, 2. Then you release it through your nose, slow, slightly unsteady, and your eyes fill almost on their own. Almost. The man in the coffin is named Edmund Hargreaves. You learned this 20 minutes ago from the card Mr. Crewe handed you at the corner of Grosvenor Square, just before the procession assembled and moved off. Edmund Arthur Hargreaves, wool merchant, age 63, survived by his wife, Mrs. Helena Hargreaves, and 3 adult children. The card is folded in your left hand right now, soft with handling, getting damp from where your fingers have been gripping it. You say the name to yourself as you walk. Edmund. Edmund. It helps to have a name. It gives the performance somewhere to anchor. The procession is moving at the pace of a man who doesn't want to arrive anywhere. 6 black horses pulling the hearse, each one wearing a black velvet headdress with tall feathered plumes that shiver in the cold October air. The hearse itself is plate glass and polished mahogany, and through the glass you can see the coffin gleaming, the brass fittings catching what little grey morning light London is offering today. Behind the hearse comes the family coach, black and sealed. 4 people inside that you can barely make out through the tinted windows. Behind that, a second carriage for extended family. Behind the carriages, 2 mutes, men in long black coats and tall silk hats swathed in crepe, walking slowly, carrying their wands, their faces holding the particular expression of complete and dedicated blankness that is the mute's only professional requirement. They are ornaments, living ornaments, and behind the mutes, walking in 2 lines of 4, the hired mourners. You are one of the hired mourners. You're not a family friend. You did not know Edmund Hargreaves. You have never been inside his house on Grosvenor Square, never sat at his table, never received a letter from him, or exchanged a word at a social occasion. You do not know what he looked like when he laughed, or how he took his morning tea, or whether he was a patient man or a quick-tempered one, a good husband or a difficult one, a father his children loved or merely tolerated. You're here because Mr. Josiah Crewe, undertaker of Bleeding Heart Yard, Holborn, arranged for you to be here, and Mr. Crewe pays you 3 shillings and 6pence per funeral, which is more than you can earn in 2 full days of most other work available to a woman in London if she has no particular skill, no family connections, and no real plan, which describes you fairly completely right now. So you walk, you hold your handkerchief to your face, and you cry for Edmund Hargreaves, wool merchant, age 63, whom you never knew. The woman walking beside you is called Dolly, Dorothy Marsh, according to Mr. Crewe's ledger, though you have never once heard anyone call her Dorothy. She's been doing this for 3 years, and she walks with her chin angled slightly down, her right hand pressed flat over her heart, her handkerchief held loosely in her left, and the effect is so completely, naturally mournful that sometimes even you feel a secondary sadness looking at her, a kind of reflected grief that surprises you. You copied her posture during your first week, and you have not stopped copying it. Dolly doesn't look at you now. At a funeral, you don't look at each other. The illusion requires that you look at the coffin, at the cobblestones a few feet ahead, at the middle distance somewhere past the horses. The family can see out of their carriage windows, and the entire point of your presence here is that they should not be able to tell from that distance which mourners are paid and which are not. The October air smells of coal smoke and wet stone and the damp wool of 8 people dressed in heavy black, walking slowly through streets that are not stopping for death. A cart of cabbages rattles past, going the other direction, the driver not even glancing at the procession. 2 boys lean out of a window above a baker's shop and watch for a moment, not with sadness, just with the mild curiosity you'd give any unusual vehicle. A woman selling hot chestnuts from a brazier on the corner steps back a few paces to let the procession pass, and you see her cross herself quickly, and then she goes back to her work. Death in London in 1872 is not a spectacle. It is not a pause. It is simply traffic, moving at a different pace. Edmund. Edmund. The church is at the end of this street. You press your fist to your sternum again and let the breath catch. You've been in London for 8 months. Before that you were Agnes Whitmore of Salford, which is close enough to Manchester that from London it might as well be the same place, though people from Salford would take exception to that. Your husband was Thomas Whitmore, who worked in a cotton mill, who had a good laugh and wide hands and a habit of humming when he didn't know he was doing it. He died 14 months ago when a shaft assembly gave way on the floor where he worked, and the mill owner paid nothing to the families of the men who died because the machinery had been properly maintained according to his own assessment of properly maintained, and nobody with the ability to dispute this assessment had bothered to do so. Thomas left you with 31 shillings, which is what was in the tin under the floorboard. That was all. The workhouse was the option people kept mentioning gently, as if it were a reasonable thing to mention. You didn't go to the workhouse. You had a distant cousin in Bermondsey, a woman called Ruth, who had married a tanner and smelled accordingly, and you wrote to Ruth, and Ruth said you could sleep on her kitchen floor while you found your feet. But she couldn't feed you, so you'd better find your feet quickly. You found your feet slowly, charring 3 days a week, sewing shirt collars at home for a clothing warehouse on Cheapside, 6pence per dozen, your fingers pricked raw every night. Then, one morning in February, you saw a notice pinned in the window of a newsagent on Leather Lane. Mr. J. Crewe, undertaker, seeks respectable women for funeral attendance. Suitable dress provided. Apply in person at the yard. Bleeding Heart Yard, Holborn. You had not known that funeral attendance was a thing someone could be paid for. You stood in front of that notice for longer than was strictly necessary, reading it several times, and then you went back to Ruth's kitchen floor and thought about it for 2 days. Then you went to Bleeding Heart Yard. That was 8 months ago. Now you are walking behind Edmund Hargreaves's coffin on a cold October morning, your left foot wet from the crack in your boot, your chest performing grief on a professional schedule, and this is simply what you do. The church door is open. The cold that pours out of it is a different kind of cold from the street, heavier, older, the cold of stone walls that never fully warm even in August. The smell changes as you file in, coal smoke and horse receding, replaced by candle wax and the sweet, slightly rotten smell of flowers that have been in water for a day too long. Chrysanthemums, white and yellow. 3 enormous arrangements flanking the altar, and more at the end of every other pew. You file in behind the mutes, behind the family, and you take your places in the pew assigned for the hired mourners, 2 rows behind the family's pew. You sit when the family sits. You rise when they rise. You bow your head at the right moments. This is part of the job too, following the liturgy at half a beat behind the people who actually know it and actually mean it. This service is 1 hour and 20 minutes. You know this because Mr. Crewe told you the schedule when he handed you the card this morning. The Reverend Thomas Whitmore conducting. And there it is, your husband's name from a stranger's mouth, and for a moment your chest tightens with something that is not performance at all. You catch yourself, look down at the hymnal, Thomas Whitmore conducting the service. It's a common enough name, it means nothing. The Reverend has a voice like old wood, deep and resonant, worn smooth by use. He speaks about Edmund Hargreaves in the way vicars speak about the recently dead. With warmth and general accuracy, the specific details thin enough to apply to almost anyone. A good husband, a man of business who dealt honestly, a father who provided, a churchgoer, a soul now returned to its maker. In the front pew, the widow, Helena Hargreaves, is weeping quietly into a black-bordered handkerchief. She's a small woman in a great deal of expensive black silk, and her grief is entirely genuine, and this is the thing about this job that you are not prepared for, and that Dolly warned you about in your first week. Never look at the family's faces, Dolly told you. The moment you look at the real grief, your performed grief falls apart. Either you start feeling it for real, which makes you useless because you can't control real grief, or you stop feeling it at all, which means your face goes blank at precisely the wrong moment. Either way, you lose the thing you're here to sell. So you keep your eyes on the Reverend, or on the middle distance just past his left shoulder, or down at the pew in front of you, and you let your chest do its work, and you hold Edmund's name in your mind like a stone you're carrying, something with weight, something real enough to cry over. Edmund Arthur Hargreaves, wool merchant, age 63. By the time the coffin is carried out to the graveyard for the interment, you have been crying gently and sustainedly for almost 90 minutes, and the base of your skull has begun to ache. This is something they don't tell you about professional mourning: the headaches. Sustained low-grade weeping over the course of 1.5 hours creates a pressure behind your eyes and at the back of your neck that does not go away until you've slept. By Thursday of a heavy week, you have cried yourself into something resembling a mild fever. Not a real fever, just the physical consequence of using your face as a professional instrument for 10 to 12 hours across 3 or 4 separate funerals. The interment takes another 30 minutes. You stand at the graveside in the correct position, handkerchief in hand, while the Reverend speaks the committal and the coffin is lowered. The grave has been dug overnight by the sextons, and the clay smell of it rises cold and mineral from the pit, mixing with the chrysanthemums that someone has brought to drop in. The widow makes a small involuntary sound when the coffin settles at the bottom. It's not a loud sound. It's the sound of something inside a person giving way. You have heard this sound at several funerals now, and it still reaches you every time. You look at a point just past the Reverend's shoulder. You hold Edmund's name. You let your chest do its work. Afterwards, outside the churchyard gates, Mr. Crewe materialises from somewhere behind the hearse, which is now being walked around to the back to be cleared and cleaned for the next use. He is a compact man, perhaps 50, with a grey beard kept close and a black coat so thoroughly pressed it looks almost architectural. He moves through a funeral with the quiet efficiency of someone who has arranged so many of them that the entire choreography is simply second nature, like breathing. He nods at you and at Dolly and at the other 6 hired mourners. He counts you with his eyes to make sure you're all present. He hands each of you a small envelope. You already know what's inside, your 3 shillings and 6pence in coin, because Mr. Crewe pays on the day. This is one of his better qualities. Hargreaves was pleased, he says, which is his way of indicating that the family expressed satisfaction with the arrangements. He does not say, "Well done." He does not say, "You did a good job." He says Hargreaves was pleased, and this is sufficient. Then he turns and walks back toward the hearse to supervise the clearing. You and Dolly walk together toward the omnibus stop. Your left foot is soaking. The headache is now a steady presence behind your right eye. The chrysanthemum smell is still on your clothes somehow, sweet and slightly wrong, and you know from experience that it will still be there when you undress tonight. "One more this week," Dolly says. She's not looking at you, looking ahead at the street, her black skirt lifted slightly in one hand to clear the mud at the curb. Thursday, Kensal Green. Crewe said it's a military man, so there'll be more walking. More walking means a longer procession, which means more time on your feet, which means the boot needs to be repaired before Thursday, or your foot will be wet for 2 hours instead of 40 minutes. You make a note of this. And Friday is the Aldgate job, you say. Friday's the Aldgate job, Dolly confirms. She has the particular talent of making any statement sound like the final word on the subject. You catch the omnibus at Piccadilly, riding on top in the cold because it's cheaper, and you sit with your hands in your lap and watch London go past and think about Edmund Hargreaves. This is the other thing about the job, the thinking about them afterward. You know almost nothing about Edmund Hargreaves except his name and profession and age and survival arrangements, and yet you have just spent nearly 2.5 hours in a state of focused, sustained emotional attention on this man, and now it's strange to simply stop. Strange to get on an omnibus and buy a halfpenny bun from the stall at the corner and go back to your room and resume being Agnes Whitmore, who is alive and cold and has a boot that needs mending. Edmund Hargreaves is in the ground in a mahogany coffin with brass fittings. He has been professionally grieved. His widow's needs have been attended to, which is the real purpose of the whole enterprise. The presence of mourners tells the world that this man was worth mourning, that people came, that he mattered. You are part of that. You told that story for him with your body and your face and your careful, controlled tears. 3 shillings and 6pence. You get off the omnibus at Holborn and walk back toward Bleeding Heart Yard. This is where you need to understand what Bleeding Heart Yard actually is, because the name alone deserves some attention. It's a real place, this yard, tucked off Greville Street, which turns off Hatton Garden in Holborn. And it's been there for centuries, a small cobbled courtyard surrounded by warehouses and workshops. And now, among other businesses, the undertaking establishment of Mr. Josiah Crewe. The name comes from a legend that the yard is where Lady Elizabeth Hatton was murdered and dismembered by the devil in 1626, her still beating heart left on the cobblestones. This is almost certainly not what happened to Lady Hatton, but people have been saying it about the yard for so long that by 1872 it's simply the name, strange and sooty, attached to an unremarkable collection of buildings that smell of sawdust and varnish from the cabinet makers next door, and sometimes of the metalwork from the iron foundry at the far end. Mr. Crewe's establishment occupies 3 floors and a ground floor workshop. The workshop is where the coffins are made, or rather, where they are finished. The carpentry work done largely off-site and brought in for lining and fitting. The first floor is the office, where Mr. Crewe keeps his ledger and his correspondence, and the meticulous scheduling that is the engine of the business. The second floor is the mourning room, though Mrs. Crewe calls it the preparation room, where the mourning dress is stored and maintained and fitted to the various women employed by the establishment. The smell of the preparation room is camphor and black dye and something slightly floral from the sachets Mrs. Crewe keeps in the wardrobes to discourage moths, and this smell is now so associated in your mind with work that it acts on you like a kind of alarm, a readying of the machinery. The third floor is where the unassigned coffins are stored, which you try not to think about. You push open the yard door and go in. Mrs. Edna Crewe is in the preparation room when you arrive, checking the inventory of dresses against a handwritten list. She's perhaps 45, with grey threaded hair pulled back very firmly, and a face that looks like someone has pressed it dry of excess expression. She's not unkind. She is simply entirely practical about everything she encounters, which in a household that deals with death on a daily basis is probably a survival mechanism. Back from Hargreaves, you say, which is how you report a completed job. Just the name, as if each funeral is a work assignment like any other, which it is. Good, she says, not looking up from her list. Thursday is the Drummond funeral at Kensal Green. Be here by 8. She makes a mark on her list. Also, the Aldgate job moved to Saturday. The family wants an extra day. Dolly told me. She nods, still not looking up. Then, as you're turning to go, the jet buttons on the second dress need replacing, the third from the bottom on the left bodice. Take it to Mrs. Harper on Leather Lane before Thursday. This is how Mrs. Crewe communicates, in tasks, sequenced and practical. You take the dress off its hook and fold it over your arm and go downstairs. At the bottom of the stairs you pass Mr. Crewe coming up from the workshop, smelling slightly of varnish and something else, something that you have learned is the smell of embalming fluid and that you never ask about. He nods at you. You nod back. 3 shillings and 6pence in the envelope in your pocket. Thursday, Kensal Green. Saturday, Aldgate. The dress needs new jet buttons. You walk out of Bleeding Heart Yard and head toward Leather Lane. Leather Lane is where you live, in the upstairs room of a boarding house kept by a woman called Mrs. Payne, who charges 4 shillings a week for the room, and an additional shilling if you want a fire in the grate, which you always do in winter and sometimes do in autumn, and the coal situation is a constant small calculation in your life. Mrs. Payne has 4 lodgers. You, a woman called Catherine who works as a seamstress for a theatrical costume on the Strand, a young man named Roberts who is studying for something legal and keeps very strange hours, and an older woman whose name you still don't know after 3 months of sharing a house with her, who works in a laundry and comes home with bright red hands every evening and eats her supper without speaking. The room is 8 feet by 10 feet. There is a bed with a horsehair mattress that has seen better decades, a washstand with a cracked mirror, a chair, a small chest of drawers, and a window that looks out onto a blank brick wall and lets in good weather, enough light to sew by. There is no fire set today because you haven't paid the extra shilling yet this week, and the room has the particular cold of a small enclosed space where no one has generated heat for 8 hours, a cold that sits in the bedclothes and in the wooden floorboards and in the ceramic basin on the washstand, and that you deal with by keeping your coat on until the chill breaks. You sit on the edge of the bed. The envelope with your 3 shillings and 6pence is still in your pocket. You take it out and add the coins to the tin on top of the chest of drawers. The tin currently holds 1 shilling and 4pence in mixed coins, which was your balance before this morning. With today's payment, that is 5 shillings and 10pence. Your rent is due Friday. The coal for the week is 1 shilling if you're careful. The boot needs a penny repair, or it will be useless by next week. After that, you need to eat. This is not profit calculation. This is not the arithmetic of commerce. This is the arithmetic of simply remaining alive, which is a different kind of mathematics entirely, the kind where all the numbers are smaller than they need to be, and the margins between sufficient and insufficient are measured in pennies. 3 shillings and 6pence is what the job pays. 3 and 6 is, for a single funeral, more than a factory girl makes in a full day, more than a seamstress earns per dozen garments, more than a charwoman makes in 2 days on her knees. This is why you answered Mr. Crewe's advertisement. This is why you're learning to cry on demand and to stand for 2 hours in bad boots on wet cobblestones and to absorb the particular heavy sadness of strangers' deaths and to carry it through an afternoon and set it down at night. You're not grateful for the job exactly. It's not the word that comes to mind, but you understand it. You understand what it is. And sometimes that's enough. You take off the morning dress, Mrs. Crewe's second best, jet buttons slightly too short, ghost sweat in the fabric, and hang it on the hook behind the door to air out before Thursday. Underneath it you're wearing your own clothes, a grey working dress that is not interesting in any way and is the better for it. You put the kettle on the small spirit burner on the washstand. You unwrap the muffin you bought at the corner when you got off the omnibus, cold now, slightly flattened from being in your coat pocket, and you eat it standing up at the window looking at the brick wall, and you think about Edmund Hargreaves again, and then, more deliberately, you stop. You're very good at stopping. You have had to get good at it. You have in 8 months grieved professionally for 47 people. They are not your grief to keep. You do the work and you put it down, the same as any other worker puts down the thing they've been carrying at the end of the day. The carpenter puts down his plane. The seamstress unclenches her hands. You stop crying for strangers and you eat a cold muffin at a window, and that is that. Except that it isn't always that clean, and some funerals follow you home in ways you can't quite explain. This one isn't going to, you can tell already. Edmund Hargreaves was a wool merchant who died at 63 and was buried with considerable expense, and his widow had good silk, and his children were adults who stood properly and wept where appropriate, and none of it was unusual. None of it snagged on anything inside you, and by tomorrow you will remember only the wet foot and the late chrysanthemums and the Reverend's voice like old wood. That is fine. That is in fact what you want from a funeral. The ones that snag are harder to put down. Dolly told you this too on your first week. She told you a great many things in the first week, in her compact, no extra words manner, while you sat in the preparation room at Bleeding Heart Yard waiting for Mrs. Crewe to finish pinning the second morning dress to fit your measurements, and Dolly stood in the doorway eating an apple and watching with the expression of someone reviewing a familiar process. She told you, always start from the chest. She told you, never eat before a funeral you think will be long, because the smell of incense and flowers on a full stomach will make you genuinely sick, and genuine sickness is not the same as genuine grief and is harder to disguise. She told you, the family will sometimes thank you afterward, and you should receive this with a small bow and say nothing, because if you say anything they will realize you are hired and the whole effect is undone. She told you, there are mourning jobs where the family is more devastated than they want the world to see, and mourning jobs where the family is less devastated than they've told themselves, and you will need to learn to tell the difference because the second kind requires more from you. She told you, bring your own handkerchiefs, always, because the ones provided by the undertaker are sometimes clean and sometimes not, and you don't want to find out at the wrong moment. She told you, you will get used to it. She did not say this as a promise. She said it as a statement of biological fact, the way you might say that wounds heal or that calluses form. The body adapts to what it is regularly asked to do. Hers had adapted. Yours would too. You asked her how she came to the job. She ate the last of her apple before answering, and the pause was long enough that you thought she wasn't going to. Same as most of us, she said finally. Needed money. Couldn't find anything better. Found out I was good at it. She dropped the apple core in the waste bin and pushed off the door frame. Don't go looking for other reasons, she said. There aren't any. This turned out to be true and not true depending on the week. There is a theory, and you heard it first from a woman called Marion who was in Mr. Crewe's employ before you arrived and left for reasons no one explained. And later you saw it written in a pamphlet that a reform-minded man was handing out outside St. Paul's one Sunday. The theory that the professional mourner serves a real social function beyond the visual effect of having more bodies at a graveside. The theory goes like this. Death. In a city the size of London, with death rates of the kind London has, with so many people dying in hospitals and workhouses and tenements, with families scattered, with neighbours who often barely know each other's names, with the old rituals of community grief becoming rarer in the overcrowded urban mass, death risks being a private, isolated, unwitnessed thing. And there is something necessary, something the human animal requires, about grief being public, about someone witnessing the loss, about the acknowledgement that a person existed and is now gone and that this matters. The hired mourner says that it matters, with her body, with her handkerchief, with her controlled, careful, professional tears. She says, this life was worth grieving, even if she never knew it, even if she was paid to say so. You think about this sometimes, usually late at night when the thinking isn't quite voluntary anymore, and then you think, 3 shillings and 6pence. And you go to sleep. Josiah Crewe started as a cabinet maker. He'll tell you this if you ask, though you have to ask because he doesn't offer personal information unprompted. He made furniture for 20 years, good solid furniture for middle-class houses, tables and wardrobes and chairs, and then one year he took a commission for coffins from an undertaker on Gray's Inn Road, who needed the extra capacity, and within 6 months the coffins were half his income, and within 2 years they were all of it. and within 5 he had the yard and the workshop and the hearse and the horses and the full establishment that he runs today. He understood something that took him a while to articulate, which is that furniture is a competitive market, but death is not. Furniture, people comparison shop. They walk into 3 different establishments, they look at the tables, they ask about the price. They come back the following Tuesday and ask again. Death doesn't work that way. When someone dies in your family, you need an undertaker immediately. You need one you've been recommended to. You need one who answers his door and sounds confident and does not, under any circumstances, look uncertain about what he's doing. Under those conditions, people will pay. They will pay more than they planned because death puts a peculiar pressure on spending, because the expense feels like love, and refusing to spend enough feels like insufficient love, and nobody wants to be the family that gave grandmother a cheap funeral. This is not cynicism, Mr. Crewe would say if you accused him of it. He doesn't say it with any apology either. He would say it as a fact of commercial life, the same as a baker understands that people will pay more for bread on a Sunday than on a Wednesday, because Sunday bread needs to be there. He is a careful man. He times his funerals precisely, routes his processions to avoid certain streets at certain hours, knows which graveyards have quick sextons and which have slow ones, knows which reverends run long and which ones are brisk. He has developed over 20 years a working relationship with grief that is almost architectural. He doesn't experience it, he constructs it, he charges accordingly. A full establishment funeral, like the Hargreaves funeral, costs somewhere between £20 and £50, depending on the elaboration, which is more than most of the families whose streets you walk through this morning will see in a year. The 6 black horses alone cost nearly £5 to hire for the day. The hearse is rented from a carriage company in Islington. The mourning dress worn by the 8 hired mourners represents an inventory that Mrs. Crewe has assembled over years, purchased and maintained and repaired and maintained again because black dye fades unevenly and crepe tears if you look at it wrong. Your 3 shillings and 6pence is a small fraction of a calculation that you're not meant to see in its entirety. You're not meant to know what Mr. Crewe charges for a hired mourner. He charges the family 4 shillings per mourner per funeral, keeps 6pence as his fee, and pays you the 3 and 6. You figured this out in your first month by listening carefully to conversations you were not quite meant to hear, and you mentioned it once to Dolly, who shrugged and said yes, and what of it? And what she said was so obviously true, that this is how every employment in London works, that someone always keeps the difference between what the work is sold for and what the worker is paid for it. That you had nothing to add. What of it? You're warm, you're eating her, the boot needs mending. Thursday's funeral is at Kensal Green Cemetery, which is in the west of the city, past Paddington, past the point where London is trying to pretend it's still countryside and failing. You've been to Kensal Green twice before. It's a garden cemetery, opened in 1833 as one of the first of what they call the Magnificent Seven, the ring of large new cemeteries built around London, when the old churchyards in the city filled up entirely, which they did, because London kept producing bodies faster than the ground could absorb them, and by the 1820s the churchyards were so overcrowded that bodies were simply stacked, layer on layer, and the soil level in some of them had risen 4 or 5 feet above the surrounding streets, and the smell in summer was something that reformers were writing pamphlets about, and residents were trying to pretend not to notice. Kensal Green solved part of this problem. So did Highgate to the north, Nunhead to the south, Tower Hamlets to the east, Abney Park and Brompton and West Norwood. 7 large planned cemeteries encircling the city, laid out with paths and trees and proper drainage and regulations about the depth of burials, and each of them representing a particular combination of civic improvement and commercial opportunity that is very Victorian in its double nature, genuinely good and genuinely profitable at the same time. Kensal Green is not a bad place to spend a morning, professionally speaking. The paths are well maintained, the trees are mature, and the monuments are the kind of elaborate stonework that people commissioned in the 1840s and 1850s, when Victorian funerary architecture was still trying to establish its visual vocabulary and hadn't yet settled on whether to be classical or Gothic or something in between. So there is a spectacular mixture of Egyptian obelisks and draped urns and weeping angels and columned mausoleums, all somewhat dulled now by decades of London soot, which settles on white Portland stone and turns it the colour of old teeth. The military funeral is for a Colonel Richard Drummond, late of the 17th Lancers, aged 71, and there are actual soldiers present, 8 men in dark blue uniforms standing very stiff at intervals along the grave, and a bugler who will play the last post, and the effect of the bugle in the open cold air of the cemetery, cutting through the trees and the mist that is hanging over the canal beyond the fence, is something that does not require professional construction. You don't have to press your fist to your sternum for Colonel Drummond. You just have to stand there and listen, and what happens in your chest happens on its own. You stand very still afterward, waiting for it to pass. Dolly is beside you. You don't look at her. Dolly told you about the bugle danger in the first month. Some jobs, she said, will get in under your guard, and the bugle is one of the reliable ones, and small children are another, and old couples where one of them is going and the other is clearly not going to know what to do with themselves are the third. With those ones, you just ride it out. You let it move through you. It passes. You go home. You eat something. You go home. You eat something. You go home. There is a boarding house ritual that you have developed over 8 months, and that you are not particularly aware of having developed until one evening in September, when Catherine the theatrical seamstress was watching you go through it and said, "You do that every time, don't you?" With the same bemused neutrality she applies to most observations. You go through it without thinking about it. You come home. You hang up the morning dress immediately on the hook behind the door, so the smell of it is not in the room with you all evening. You wash your face and hands with the coldish water from the basin, and you wash them thoroughly, more thoroughly than strictly necessary, which is not superstition, and you refuse to call it superstition. It is simply a personal preference for thoroughness. You change into your grey dress. You eat whatever you have, bread, or the end of some cheese, or a pie bought from the woman on the corner of Hatton Garden, who does mutton pies on Tuesdays and Thursdays for a penny each. You sit by the window for a while and look at the brick wall, and let the day settle into the past tense, into the category of things that have already happened, which is where things belong. Then you do something that has no professional aspect to it at all. You read. You found a lending library on Clerkenwell Road, £1 a month, and you take out 2 books at a time and read them in the evenings and on Sundays, sitting in the chair by the window in your grey dress with a cup of tea. And this is the part of your life that is entirely yours, not Thomas's widow, not Mr. Crewe's hired mourner, not Mrs. Payne's lodger, just Agnes reading. You're currently reading a novel about a woman who makes terrible decisions for comprehensible reasons, which you find more comforting than it probably should be. The Aldgate funeral on Saturday is different from the others, in ways that take you a few minutes to understand, standing at the corner where Mr. Crewe has directed you to assemble. The street is narrower, the buildings are older and more crowded together. The people watching from the pavements as the procession assembles are dressed more plainly, and there are more of them, and they watch with an attention that is different from the mild curiosity of a Grosvenor Square street. They're watching because they know who is being buried. 2 women standing in a doorway are already crying before the procession moves. This is an East End funeral, and an East End funeral has different rules. The coffin is plain elm, not mahogany. The hearse has 2 horses, not 6, and the plumes are smaller. There is 1 mute instead of 2, and there are 4 hired mourners instead of 8, because the family has arranged for several of their neighbours and friends to walk, and there are enough real mourners that the hired ones are less visible in the crowd. This is, Mr. Crewe explained when he briefed you on this job, a different kind of assignment. You're not here to supply the appearance of grief to an upper-middle-class family that wants a socially appropriate level of visible mourning. You're here to supplement a genuine community that is grieving, to fill out the processional so that the numbers are respectable, to provide the specific visual element that the family has requested but cannot supply themselves. The woman being buried is Mary Ellen Dyer, aged 34, who died of complications after the birth of her 4th child, and the child died with her. You learned this from the card, and the card also says, survived by her husband, John Dyer, labourer, and 3 children. Thomas aged 6, Ellen aged 4, William aged 2. You stand with the 3 other hired mourners. Dolly's not here today, it's you and a woman named Pearl and 2 others you don't know. And you wait for the procession to form, and you look at the people assembling, and there is a man at the front of the group standing next to the coffin cart, and he is holding a small girl in his arms, and the small girl has her face pressed into his neck, and is making a high, thin, uncontrolled sound, and the man is not making any sound at all, which is worse. That is John Dyer, the surviving husband, the labourer, standing with his daughter who is 4 years old and who does not understand and who is making that sound. You press your fist to your sternum. You do not need to say Mary Ellen's name to yourself. The name is not the point today. The point is that sound. Look past his shoulder, Dolly told you. When you look at them, you lose control. Look past his shoulder. You look past his shoulder at the street ahead. You walk. This is not the kind of funeral you put down easily. It follows you home on the omnibus, Mary Ellen Dyer, who died at 34, her husband standing with his face empty, and his daughter making that sound. It follows you up the stairs of Mrs. Payne's boarding house and into the room and sits on the edge of the bed while you hang up the mourning dress and wash your hands and face. You eat the mutton pie and it doesn't taste like anything. You sit by the window and look at the brick wall and you think, she was 34, you're 26. Thomas died and left you with 31 shillings. You think, this is not about you. You think, the child died too. You sit by the window until it is fully dark outside and the brick wall is invisible, and the sounds from the street below are the evening sounds, different from the afternoon sounds, lower and more dispersed. Then you take your book from the drawer and you read until the candle gets low, and then you blow it out and lie down in the dark and listen to London settling around you. Outside, somewhere down the lane, a child is crying. It is probably nothing to do with anything. Children cry at night for all sorts of reasons. You know this. You lie in the dark and wait for sleep, and sleep comes, eventually, the way it always does. This is the work. This is what it is. But before you sleep, you think about a thing that Dolly said once. Not as instruction, but as an observation. almost to herself in the preparation room at Bleeding Heart Yard while she was pressing out the wrinkles in the third best dress with the flat iron. She was talking about a funeral she'd done years ago, before Mr. Crewe, when she was working for a different undertaker in Whitechapel, and she said, "The thing nobody tells you is that sometimes you actually help. I don't mean pretending to help. I mean you look up at a funeral and there's some widow who came without family, came alone to bury her husband alone, and she's sitting there like, there's nothing to be done about anything, and you're sitting 2 rows back looking mournful and completely there and present and not going anywhere, and you think—" She paused and pressed the iron down carefully on a sleeve, watching the fabric. "You think, well, at least she's not alone." She picked up the iron and moved it to the neck section. "Which isn't nothing," she said. "Is it?" You didn't answer. She hadn't been asking you. But she was right. It isn't nothing. There are things about this city that you are still learning to understand 8 months in, and one of them is the way death works here at scale. In Salford you knew who died. You knew them, or you knew someone who knew them, and the news travelled through the streets, and the streets tightened around the grief and held it. London does not do this. London is too large for this kind of tightening. People die in it constantly, every hour, every day, in every neighbourhood, in hospitals and in crowded rooms and in streets, and the city absorbs it the way the Thames absorbs rain, barely changing its level, barely acknowledging the addition. Death in London is permanent and universal and largely anonymous. The funeral industry is one of the mechanisms by which this gets managed. Not just managed practically, the bodies disposed of, the paperwork filed, the graves dug, but managed emotionally, ritually, in the way that human beings require. The hearse, and the horses, and the mutes, and the hired mourners, and the specific architecture of a Victorian funeral procession. All of it is a technology for making death visible enough to grieve properly. For saying, publicly and with ceremony, this person was here, and now they are not, and this matters. And sometimes it requires hired labour to say it, because real grief is too variable, too easily overwhelmed or absent or excessive, too human to be relied upon for a 2-hour public performance. So you hire it, the way you hire musicians for a wedding, the way you hire a chef for a dinner party, the way you outsource any skilled performance that the occasion requires but the participants cannot supply. You are a skilled performer of public grief. 3 shillings and 6pence per performance. The headache behind your right eye, which is almost constant by the end of a heavy week, is an occupational hazard. Mrs. Harper on Leather Lane, who repairs the jet buttons on the second dress and knows what you do for a living, gave you a piece of dried willow bark once, and told you to chew it when the headache comes on, and this helps slightly, in the way that things that are almost enough slightly help. You are thinking about all of this in a partial, not quite deliberate way as you sit by the window in the dark after the Aldgate funeral, and then you stop thinking about it because the brick wall outside the window has become the vague field of not quite nothingness that happens just before sleep, and you let it come. London murmurs outside. It always murmurs. Even in the small hours it doesn't go fully quiet, just quieter. A lower register of cartwheels and footsteps and the occasional call of a watchman. You have stopped hearing it as a noise and started hearing it as a constant, like the sound of your own blood. You're 26 years old and you live in a room that is 8 feet by 10 feet, and you're learning to cry on schedule for money, and the man you married is in the ground in Salford, and the city is enormous and indifferent. And here you are anyway, inside it, alive, which is something. Thomas would have found it strange. The mourning job. He had a practical mind and would have nodded and said, "Yes, well, that pays," and then moved on to something else. He wouldn't have found the strangeness in it because he had that quality of moving through life without snagging on the philosophical corners of things, which was sometimes frustrating and sometimes the best possible company. You miss the not snagging. You are a snagger by nature, a person who catches on things and turns them over and looks at their undersides. Thomas balanced this. Without him, you're snagging on everything. Which is possibly why you are good at the job. Why you can hold Edmund Hargreaves in your mind as a stone with weight, and why you know, without quite knowing how you know, when to look past a shoulder and when to let something reach you and how long to let the chest do its work before pulling back. You're very good at grief. You have reason to be. You wake before the bells. This happens sometimes. Your body has developed its own clock in this city, ticking against the official time kept by the churches, and occasionally your clock runs a few minutes fast and you surface in the grey before light, with no sound to account for it, just the sense of having arrived at the surface of sleep and found the day already waiting there. The room is cold. The fire from last night is long out, just ash behind the grate, and your breath makes a faint ghost in the air above your face. The horsehair mattress holds your warmth if you stay perfectly still, but the moment you shift, the cold finds the gap, and you're reminded that it is November, and that November in London is a particular kind of argument against getting up. You get up anyway. The water in the basin has a skim of ice at the edges. Not full ice, just the suggestion of it, the water thickening towards something more decided. You break it with your fingers, which are immediately numb, and you wash your face and hands in the cold, and this wakes you up the way nothing else does, brutally and completely, as if your nervous system has been waiting for an excuse to fire. You dress. Grey dress, stockings, boots. The left boot has been repaired. You took it to the cobbler on St. Cross Street 2 days ago, a penny for the sole, and now both feet stay dry, which is such a material improvement to daily existence that you're still experiencing small surges of satisfaction every time you step over a wet patch without consequence. It is possible that the bar for satisfaction has been set quite low in your current life, and you are making peace with this. Downstairs, the older woman whose name you still don't know is already in the kitchen, her hands wrapped round a tin mug, her face carrying the expression of someone who has not yet decided whether the day is worth the effort. Her laundry-reddened hands are rougher than yours by several degrees of suffering, cracked at the knuckles, the skin thickened and split in places that are clearly permanent, the kind of damage that happens when you're in hot water and cold water alternately for 10 hours a day every working day. You make tea and don't try to start a conversation, because she has never in 3 months started one, and you take your mug back upstairs. The ledger in your head, the one you maintain without quite intending to, 4 funerals this week. Hargreaves Monday, Drummond Thursday, Aldgate Saturday, and a new one today Sunday, which is unusual. Mr. Crewe doesn't generally schedule Sundays, but this one is requested by the family, a private arrangement, a small ceremony, a woman named Charlotte Parish at St. Andrews in Holborn. Small funeral, 4 hired mourners, 7 shillings for the day. You finish your tea, wrap yourself in your coat, and the heavy knitted muffler that you bought from a street stall in September for 2pence, and that is the single most practically useful garment you own, and you head for Bleeding Heart Yard. The thing about the Victorian mourning industry that you're slowly understanding working from the inside of it is that it is vast in ways that are not visible from any single position within it. You see Josiah Crew's corner of it, the undertaking, the funeral arrangements, the hired mourners. But the mourning industry is not just about funerals. It is about everything that surrounds death, which in 1872 is extraordinary in its extent. When a woman's husband dies, she must be in full mourning for 2 years. This is not a suggestion. It is a social requirement enforced not by law, but by something more reliable than law, by the opinion of everyone around her, by the subtle and not so subtle signals of approval and disapproval that constitute the social atmosphere she breathes. To be seen in any colour in the first year of widowhood is to invite judgment of the most damaging kind. The judgment that says she did not love him properly, or she is in indecent haste to move on. And in a world where a widow's social standing, her ability to remarry if she needs to, her place in the networks of support and connection that middle-class life depends on, in a world where all of this depends on being thought respectable, the opinion of neighbours about your mourning dress matters materially. So women buy mourning dress, and they buy it in quantities that seem, from the outside of this world, almost incomprehensible. Full mourning means black, not just any black, but the specific flat, light-absorbing black of crepe, which is a particular kind of silk that has been treated with a crimping process that gives it a dull, grained surface that does not reflect light. Crepe is expensive. Crepe is also difficult to maintain because it shrinks and distorts when it gets wet, which in London means it is almost continuously under threat, and because the dye it's made with bleeds in the rain and leaves black streaks down whatever garment it trims, crepe is not a practical fabric. It is a suffering fabric. It is a fabric that announces, through the suffering it imposes on its wearer, that the grief is real and the sacrifice is genuine. After the first year, you can move to half mourning. Half mourning means you can introduce grey, lavender, white. You can reduce the proportion of crepe. You can wear jet jewellery instead of only jet. Add in perhaps some amethyst or some plain pearl. You are approaching the edge of the dark country. You can see the border of ordinary life from here. After 2 years, you are out of mourning. You're free. You can wear whatever you like. You can go back to colour, unless your mother-in-law dies during your first year of widowhood, in which case you begin the clock again, or unless your own mother dies, or your father, or a sibling. The period for each varies. A year for a parent, 6 months for a sibling, 3 months for an aunt or uncle. If you are a Victorian woman in a large family during a period of high mortality, it is entirely possible to spend the better part of a decade in mourning dress without a break, moving from one regulated grief to the next, your wardrobe a continuous exercise in calibrated black. The companies that make and sell mourning dress have built entire businesses on this system. On Regent Street there is a shop called Jay's London General Mourning Warehouse, and the word warehouse is not an exaggeration. It is 4 floors. It employs hundreds of staff, and it sells nothing but mourning goods, dress fabric, crepe by the yard, ready-made gowns, bonnets, gloves, handkerchiefs, stationery, jewellery, everything a grieving woman requires in order to perform her grief correctly and visibly, to the standards the age requires. It also rents. If you cannot afford to buy a full mourning wardrobe, and most women cannot because death is expensive and comes without warning, Jay's will rent you the garments for a fee. Return them when the period is over. Dolly took you to Jay's once, on a Thursday in September, when there were no funerals scheduled, and Mrs. Crewe had asked her to look at their current crepe stock for possible purchase. You walked up Regent Street, which is a street that makes you feel slightly fraudulent, everything too polished and too expensive and too sure of itself, and you went through the door at Jay's and stood in a room that smelled of black dye and the particular dusty floral smell of rooms where fabric is stored in quantity, and you looked at 4 floors of mourning. There were black silk gowns trimmed with crepe in graduated proportions for each stage of mourning. There were black parasols and black fans and black muffs and black reticules. There were bonnets in every degree of refinement, from the plain and functional to the spectacularly elaborate, with veils in varying lengths, because the length of your veil signals the depth of your loss. A widow's veil falling to the knees for the first year, rising gradually as the mourning period progresses, a language of grief written in silk gauze and measurable in inches. There were jet beads, proper Whitby jet mined from the cliffs in Yorkshire, and cheaper black glass that looked like jet and cost a fraction as much, and that experienced eyes could tell apart at 20 paces. And the difference between jet and black glass is, in mourning terms, the difference between genuine grief and gesture, though no one would put it quite so bluntly. There were stationery sets with black edges. The width of the black border told you the relationship to the deceased. A 1/2-inch border for a parent, narrowing over the years until you were down to a thin line that was almost decorative, grief thinning into memory. There were black wax seals and black ribbons, and a small section in the corner that sold, discreetly, the equipment for making mourning jewellery from the hair of the deceased, which is its own strange corner of this world that we'll come to in time. You stood in the middle of all of this and thought, this is a business built on sorrow. And then you thought, but then so is mine. Dolly was brisk and businesslike, examining crepe bolts with a professional eye, rubbing small sections between her fingers to test the weight, holding them up to the light to assess the density of the crimp. She knew what she was looking for, and she found it, and she ordered the appropriate quantity, and spoke to the counter girl in the clipped, efficient manner of a trade buyer, which is what she was in this context. On the way out she stopped at a glass case near the door and looked at a black brooch, a painted oval of black enamel in a gold frame, perhaps an inch across. There was a curl of hair behind the glass. "Whose hair is that?" you asked. "The deceased's," she said. "Usually, sometimes the mourners. Depends who commissioned it." She looked at it for a moment longer. "My mother had one made of my father. She wore it every day for the rest of her life." She turned away from the case. "Come on," she said. "We've got Tuesday's appointment to prepare for." The hierarchy of professional mourning is something you have assembled gradually, piece by piece, from things Dolly has said and things Mr. Crewe has mentioned and things you've observed yourself, and it goes roughly like this. At the top, in terms of pay and prestige, are the mutes. Mutes are almost exclusively male. They stand at the front door of the house, where the deceased lies from the time the body is brought home until the funeral, silent, motionless, wrapped in black from hat to boot, their wands held before them, their faces arranged in the expression that is not quite sorrow and not quite blankness, but something between, a studied neutrality that suggests deep feeling too profound to be expressed. They are expensive. They charge by the hour. They represent a considerable investment of funerary budget, and their presence signals that the family is serious about this, that money is not an obstacle, that the dead deserves the full ritual. Mutes are, Dolly once told you, even harder to sustain than weepers. Not emotionally. Emotionally they're easier, because you're not performing active grief, just presence. But physically, standing perfectly still for hours in all weather, on a doorstep in November, in the rain, in the kind of fog that turns everything to grey felt, not moving, not speaking, not doing anything except existing in black and being visible. That is its own endurance test. The mutes she's known have mostly been older men with joints that speak to them about the cold in extended monologues by the end of winter. Below the mutes, hired mourners like you. Walking mourners, processional mourners, graveside mourners. Your job is movement, is attendance, is the visible presence of grief in motion. The physical requirements are different. You're on your feet for 2 to 4 hours typically, walking the route, standing through the service, standing at the graveside. But you are active, which helps with the cold and with the sustained performance. And then there is a third category, which is where Dolly sits when she is working at her highest level, which is the weeper. Weeping, real demonstrative weeping, is not part of every funeral. It is specifically requested, usually by families that want a more emotional register than walking mourners provide. East End funerals sometimes request it. Irish funerals, when they use hired mourners at all, often request it. Some families simply want the sound of grief as well as the sight of it. The weeper provides this. A good weeper is rare and paid accordingly. Dolly makes 4 shillings and 9 pence for a weeping engagement. She can sustain active, audible weeping for up to 90 minutes without losing control of it, which is the specific skill. The weeping must sound genuine but must remain controlled, must not escalate into hysteria or sink into a performed emptiness that sounds nothing like real grief. She has the pitch, the specific broken breath quality of genuine weeping, and she can access it on demand the way a singer accesses a note, from somewhere inside the body that most people can't locate voluntarily. You asked her how she learned to do it. The pause before her answer was longer than usual. Practice, she said, and then, and I had good material to practice on early on. You didn't ask what she meant. You understood what she meant. You have not yet been asked to do a weeping engagement. Mrs. Crewe is not sure you're ready. She told you in September, and you agreed, because you are not sure you are ready either. Walking mourning you can sustain without losing the thread of it. You can hold the performance across 2 hours while also tracking the service and the family and the route and the weather and the practical details. Weeping is a deeper register, and once you're in it, the practical tracking is much harder. And if something goes wrong, if the family does something unexpected, if a real emotion breaks through the performed one, you need to be able to recover without the break being visible. And that requires a level of control that you're still developing. That is the word Mrs. Crewe uses. Developing. Like something in a photograph. Slowly becoming clear. The Sunday funeral for Charlotte Parish at St Andrews is small and contains no surprises. 4 hired mourners, including you, 8 family members, a vicar who knows the family well and speaks about Charlotte specifically and warmly in ways that make clear this is a real woman with a real history, a woman who ran a lending library from her front room for 20 years and who taught herself Italian from a grammar book because she wanted to read Dante in the original, and who made, according to the vicar, an exceptional pork terrine that her neighbours has been requesting the recipe for since 1863 and that she steadfastly refused to share. This gets a small laugh from the family, the kind of laugh that happens at funerals when someone remembers a specific thing, and it is the truest moment of the service, the truest piece of grief, and you are looking past the vicar's shoulder when it happens, but you feel it anyway, the way you feel warmth when you're not quite facing a fire. Charlotte Parish, 61. Dante and Terrine. You put her in the past tense on the omnibus going home, and she stays there. November deepens, the days get shorter, which in London means the days get darker, which means the particular colour of a London winter morning, which is the colour of old pewter, arrives earlier and stays longer. The fog comes. Not every day, but often enough that you learn to check the smell of the air when you push open the window in the morning, before you've fully committed to the day to assess what's out there. When the fog comes in properly, it is not like any fog you experienced in Salford. That fog was damp and grey and cold, the normal fog of a northern industrial town. London fog in November is something with more character than that. Something that has been assembled over decades from the interaction of the city's million coal fires and the Thames's moisture and the cold air coming off the estuary, and the result is a substance that is not quite air and not quite smoke and not quite water, that settles in layers and deadens sound and reduces visibility to 20, 10, 5 feet, and that smells of sulphur and soot and something older and more mineral underneath, the smell of the river mud exposed at low tide, as if the city's foundations are making themselves known. Fog and funerals have a relationship. On a clear day, a funeral procession moves through a city that ignores it. On a foggy day, a funeral procession becomes the fog, becomes part of it, becomes something that appears out of the grey ahead of you and passes and dissolves back into it, and the effect is genuinely spectral. The black horses and the black hearse and the black-dressed mourners emerging from and returning to visibility in a way that no clear day can produce. You've had 3 fog funerals now. They are the ones you remember the most clearly, which is strange, because in a fog you can see the least. The first one was in Paddington, a middle-aged merchant banker named Forsyth, and the fog that day was light enough to see perhaps 30 feet ahead, and the hearse moved through it like a ship through low cloud, and the black plumes on the horses' heads disappeared into the grey before the tails of the horses were fully visible, and walking behind you had the sensation of following something into a country that might not have an exit, which is extremely on the nose for a funeral, and which you have never entirely shaken. The second fog funeral was worse. This was in Southwark, in December, in a fog thick enough that you could not see the hearse from the back of the processional line, could only hear the creak of the wheels and the muffled sound of the horses' hooves, and you walked by sound, following the sound of the thing you couldn't see, which is, and you're aware this is becoming heavy with meaning, a reasonable description of what you do every day, in and out of fog. The third was at Kensal Green again, and that one you'll come to. In the meantime, November, and the preparatory work of staying alive in London in winter, which involves coal and mended boots, and the calculation of whether the extra shilling for the fire is affordable this week, which it usually is, and the management of the morning wash when the water is genuinely cold enough to hurt your fingers, and the wearing of every layer of clothing you reasonably own on Sundays when you're not working, and therefore not moving enough to generate your own warmth. Mrs. Payne's house is not cold exactly. She keeps the kitchen fire going, which warms the ground floor tolerably, and the heat rises some distance up the stairs, and if you're willing to spend time in the kitchen, which requires tolerating the presence of the laundrywoman, and occasionally Robert's the legal student who likes to hold court about whatever he's been reading, and he is always reading something and always ready to explain it to whoever is nearest, then you can stay warm at no personal coal expense. You've become quite good at tolerating Roberts. He is 23 and has the specific confidence of a young man who has recently discovered that he has opinions, and finds them very interesting, and he speaks in long, compound sentences that double back on themselves, and he addresses everyone as though they should be grateful for the explanation. But he's not unkind, and he's warm in a body temperature sense. And on certain evenings when the fog is pressing against the windows and the coal upstairs is running low, his company in the kitchen is net positive. He found out what you do, the morning work. In October, from Catherine the theatrical seamstress, who mentioned it without apparent thought for what Roberts might do with the information, which was to find it extremely interesting from a sociological perspective, and to ask you several questions about it over several evenings in the kitchen, with the focused intensity of a person compiling evidence. You answered the questions, mostly because they were not bad questions, and because answering them is, you've discovered, one way of doing the thing you do after every funeral: processing, filing, putting events into the past tense where they belong. He asked what the hardest part was. You said the headaches. He looked disappointed, and you said, and the fog funerals. He looked more interested. You said, there's something about following a sound you can't see, in weather that turns everything into abstraction, carrying a grief that isn't yours, for a person you never knew. He wrote something in his notebook. You told him if he published anything about you without asking, you'd throw his notebook in the fire. He looked alarmed. You told him you were joking. You were mostly joking. He asked, does it get easier? And you said, without thinking much about it, yes. And that's the complicated part. Because it does get easier. The technique gets smoother. The chest trick is automatic now, and the look past the shoulder is automatic, and the management of the headache is something you can do in your sleep, almost literally. You know which funerals will be long and which ones will be efficient. You know which reverends like the sound of their own voice, and which ones are mercifully brisk. You know how to eat before a long one, and how to pace your water intake so you don't need to find facilities mid-procession. You know how to walk in wet cobblestones in a long skirt. You know how to hold a hat against a November wind without it looking like you're fighting the wind. You know how to stand for 90 minutes without your back beginning its complaints too early. All of this getting easier is, in itself, a kind of getting used to death, a kind of domestication of the thing that 14 months ago arrived in your life uninvited in the form of a mill shaft assembly and 31 shillings in a tin. You're not sure how to feel about the domestication. It seems like a loss of something. It also seems like survival, which is not nothing. It's that recent, that real. There is a funeral in November that you are not expecting to go the way it goes. It is a Wednesday, which is a reliable funeral day. Monday and Wednesday and Saturday tend to be heavy. Thursday and Friday lighter, Sunday rare. And it is a Kensington funeral, which means a large house and a large budget and a correspondingly elaborate procession. The deceased is a man named Sir Gerald Atwood Fenn, Baronet, age 78, who died of old age in a bed that probably cost more than your room for a year, in a house in Onslow Square that occupies so much of one side of a very pleasant street that the proportion of London real estate owned by one man is briefly embarrassing to contemplate. Mr. Crewe briefs you Thursday evening in the preparation room. 8 hired mourners, 2 mutes at the front of the processional instead of at the back. Extra feathers on the horses. This is a baronet, not a mere merchant. The family has requested that the mourners be positioned to best visual effect along the processional route, which is longer than usual because Sir Gerald apparently wished his funeral to pass certain streets, and Mr. Crewe is nothing if not accommodating of final wishes, provided they pay. The dress for this one is the best dress, the first best, the the one with the real jet buttons that are sewn on properly and that catch the light in the way that glass doesn't. You haven't worn it before. Mrs. Crewe brings it down from the second floor on a wooden hanger and holds it next to you with the critical eye of a woman assessing fit. 12 minutes of alterations, she says to no one in particular, meaning the hem needs to come up slightly, meaning she will do this tonight, meaning you should come 15 minutes early on Wednesday morning so there is time to check. The dress fits when you try it Wednesday morning. The hem is right. The jet buttons run from collar to waist, and they are objectively very fine buttons, each one a perfect sphere of black that absorbs light like a small eye. And you stand in the preparation room in the first best dress, and the mirror fragment on the wall shows you a version of yourself that is composed and solid and substantial in a way that your grey working dress never quite manages. This is the other thing about the mourning dress that nobody talks about very much. It is, in its own severe way, beautiful. The absolute black, the quality of the fabric, the specific weight of it. It does not flatter in the way that fashionable dress flatters, playing with colour and silhouette and decoration. It does something else. It makes you grave. It makes you matter. You stand in it and you feel the occasion closing around you, and you understand in your body why the Victorians built such an elaborate architecture of mourning, because the architecture is not empty. It has weight. It says something real about what death is and what it costs. You understand this, and then you walk out into the November morning in the first best dress with the real jet buttons and your dry boots and your muffler, and Dolly is already at the Onslow Square corner, and you assemble with the other 6 mourners, and Mr. Crewe appears in his architectural coat and nods at you all, and the procession forms, and you begin. And when I say a Kensington establishment funeral, I need you to understand what that means in 1872 terms. This is not modern expensive, where expensive means things arrive on time and look polished. This is expensive at a scale that requires weeks of planning and dozens of people in the coordination of an industry. 8 black horses. 8. 4 pulling the hearse and 4 in a secondary ceremonial formation. Their plumes so tall and dense they look like a moving hedge. 3 carriages for the family and extended mourners. 2 mutes in hats that add another foot to their considerable height. 8 hired mourners, walking 2 by 2, slow and steady, the black crepe of their dresses and hats moving together in a single dark mass. Leading the whole procession, ahead even of the hearse, a man on a black horse carrying a black pennant with the Atwood Fen family crest. Behind the mourners, more family coaches. Behind those, a small contingent of what appear to be staff from the baronet's various houses and business interests, perhaps 30 people in total, all in black. The street stops for this procession, not because death is unusual in London, because this particular death is being announced at a volume that demands acknowledgement. You walk, and you hold the name, Gerald, and you find, for the first time in a while, that the name doesn't give you much to hold on to. Gerald Atwood Fen, Baronet, who had a great deal of money and chose to spend some of it on an extremely visible funeral, and whose family is in the carriages behind you, and whose wife, his 3rd wife, 40 years younger than him, is dressed in more expensive black silk than you will ever touch in your working life, and whose 3 sons from his first marriage are reportedly not speaking to each other or to the 3rd wife, which is the kind of domestic complexity that Mr. Crewe has learned to plan around. No eye contact between the 3rd wife's carriage and the first family's carriage, for instance, a carefully designed procession order that keeps certain vehicles apart. You do not hold Gerald and feel anything in particular. You do the chess trick and it works mechanically and the performance is adequate and the family will be pleased and you will have 4 shillings for the day because Kensington pays more, and none of it reaches you the way Aldgate reached you, and none of it will follow you home. And this is where the complication lives, the one you mentioned to Roberts, the getting easier, because you are aware as you walk through Kensington on a cold November morning, behind the greatest quantity of black feathers you have ever seen assembled in one place, that you are at 2 removes from this man's death. You are hired, you are performing, and you're not even performing particularly hard, because there is nothing in this man's life as you have access to it that catches on anything in you. He was a baronet. He was 78. He died in his bed. His 3rd wife is in the carriage behind you in expensive silk, and the question of whether that silk represents genuine grief or the relief of freedom is not yours to adjudicate. You walk, you perform, you collect your 4 shillings, but that evening back in the room, eating bread and cheese, you sit with the unease that this has produced and you try to locate it. You turn it over the way you'd turn over a stone to see what lives underneath. And what you find is this: you can tell the difference. You can feel in your body the difference between a funeral that requires something real from you and a funeral that does not, between a performance and a true performance, if that makes any sense, which it might not. Between the chess trick working mechanically and the chess trick working because there is something behind it. You're not sure what to do with this information. You're not sure it's useful to know. You write a letter to your mother in Salford and tell her you are well and that London is cold and that the work is steady. You do not tell her what the work is. She would find it strange, and the finding it strange would require explanation, and the explanation would require you to explain things about your life in London that you're not ready to put in a letter yet. You tell her the work is steady, and that you have enough, and that you're thinking of getting a better coat before the real cold comes. She writes back with advice about the coat and about eating enough vegetables. The letter takes 4 days in each direction, which makes the correspondence feel like 2 people communicating across a significant gulf in time, shouting things over a chasm and hearing the response a week later, by which time the thing shouted has become less urgent. You miss her in the specific physical way that is mostly about the sound of her voice, and the way a kitchen smells when someone you love is cooking in it. You are 26 years old. You are managing. In early December there is a Sunday when you are not working, and the city has not yet reached the particular Christmas pitch that will arrive in another 2 weeks, and Dolly suggests, with her characteristic lack of preamble, that you come with her to Highgate. What's at Highgate, you say, knowing already what's at Highgate because the name is impossible to be in London and not know, but asking anyway. A hill, she says. You can see the city. You go on the omnibus from Holborn, up through Islington, through streets that get gradually more residential and less commercial, through the kind of neighbourhoods where London is trying to be a little bit countryside and largely succeeding, the houses getting larger and further apart, the trees more frequent. The air changes as you go north. It doesn't get clean exactly. No air in London is ever fully clean, but it gets lighter, thinner, less laden, and the colour of the sky is a proper pale grey instead of the darker, active grey that sits over the city centre. Highgate Cemetery opened in 1839, and it is the most theatrically elaborate of the Magnificent Seven. Where Kensal Green is formal and classical, Highgate is Gothic and romantic, which is to say it is exactly the kind of cemetery that 1839 dreamed about when it thought about death and permanence and the proper way to be remembered. There are Egyptian Avenue and the Lebanese Cedar Terrace, a colonnade of arched doorways cut into the hillside, each one leading to a small family vault, the doors sealed with stone and iron. There are monuments that are architecture in miniature, small temples and mausoleums and obelisks, all wearing the same progressive patina of moss and soot and London weather. There are paths that wind between the graves in ways that seem more designed for contemplation than for practical navigation, as if the architect wanted you to be slightly uncertain of your direction, to be delayed by beauty, to find yourself around a corner you hadn't planned on taking, face to face with a carved angel larger than you are. The cedar of Lebanon that gives the terrace its name is enormous, older than the cemetery itself, already massive when the cemetery was built around it, and it spreads its flat canopy over the path in a way that makes the light under it different from the light anywhere else, older somehow, heavier, as if the tree has been absorbing shadows for centuries. You've been to Highgate for funerals twice. Both times the procession arrived at the Egyptian gate on Swains Lane, moved through the tunnel of the Egyptian Avenue, and emerged into the space around the cedar, and both times the effect of that emergence from the narrow arched enclosed avenue into the open space under that tree was something you were not prepared for, a sudden expansion of scale, a shift of register, the stone and the cedar and the sky all arriving at once. For funerals you look past shoulders. Today, with no procession, no family, no performance required, you look. The hill rises behind the western side of the cemetery, and Dolly takes you up a path that winds through the graves and out through a gate at the top and up to an area of parkland above, and when you get to the right point on that hill and turn south, London is there. And when I say London is there, I need you to understand what you're seeing, not the specific famous skyline that later centuries will produce, the towers and the wheel and the clustered modern glass. What you see in 1872 from this hill on a clear cold December Sunday is a different skyline, lower and broader and more horizontal, but with its own defining vertical. St. Paul's Dome rising above everything else to the south, just slightly hazy with distance, the gold of the cross at its summit catching what light there is. Around the dome, a sea of rooftops, an ocean of them, extending further than you can make out in the haze, reaching the full extent of your vision in every direction, every roof a different height and angle, the geometry of a city that grew without a single plan by a million individual decisions, chimney stacks rising from every surface, the smoke from them caught in the still December air and hanging in a faint collective exhalation over the whole. The Thames you cannot see from here, it's too far south, lost in the haze, but you know it's there, running through the middle of all those rooftops, carrying its cargo and its watermen and its ferry boats and its ships in from the sea. 500,000 people, more, all of them under those rooftops going about their Sunday. You stand on the hill in Dolly's company in the December cold and you look at it. My brother's down there somewhere, Dolly says after a while. It's the most personal thing she has said to you in 3 months. Where? Whitechapel. Same street we grew up on, more or less. She pauses. He never left. I always thought that meant I was the brave one. She says it flatly, not with self-pity, just as an observation about her own previous assessment of a situation. Were you? I don't know anymore. She turns away from the view. Cold up here. You stay for another few minutes after she starts down the path. Just you and the view and the cold and the particular sound of a high place, which is the sound of wind with no buildings to interrupt it, moving freely across the hill in ways that it cannot do in the streets below. The city keeps dying and being born at the same time every day without pause. every day in London, 30, 40, 50 people die, which means every day 30, 40, 50 funerals are being arranged, which means every day the black horses are being harnessed, and the crepe is being taken down from the wardrobes, and the hired mourners are pressing their fist to their sternums and saying names in their heads. You're one small mechanism in a very large machine. You knew this. You know it more from up here, looking at the size of the machine. You go down the hill and catch the omnibus home with Dolly, both of you not speaking much but not uncomfortably. And in the evening you sit in the kitchen for warmth, and Roberts reads you a passage from something about urban sanitation reform that he finds electrifying, and you drink your tea and the evening passes, and you go to bed, and outside London continues its conversation with death, as it always does, without pause, without end. December brings the Christmas funerals. This is the other thing they don't tell you before you take the job. Christmas kills people. Not the spirit of Christmas, not anything seasonal or symbolic, but the practical mechanics of midwinter London. The cold, which finds the elderly and the sick and the very young, kills them in their beds in December, at a rate that would shock you if you hadn't now seen 3 months of winter. The fogs, which are at their thickest in December, trap the coal smoke at ground level and produce the specific London phenomenon that people have started calling a pea super, which sounds almost charming and is in fact a public health catastrophe, yellow-green and dense as felt, that keeps the sun away entirely for days at a time and irritates the lungs and sends those already weakened by illness into a rapid decline. The combination of cold and fog and bad air and inadequate nutrition in winter means that December and January are the months when you are busiest. You are busiest in December. Wednesday, the 10th of December, you have 2 funerals. This is possible because the first one is at 9 in the morning and ends by 11:30, and the second doesn't begin until 2, and the routes are on different sides of the city, and Mr. Crewe is very precise about the scheduling, and knows it can be done if you eat during the interval and don't dawdle at the graveside. The first funeral is in Holborn, close enough to Bleeding Heart Yard that you walk there, and it is a respectable tradesman, a butcher of 49 who died of a chest complaint that had been developing for 3 winters, and his family is his wife and 2 grown daughters and a son who looks very like him. And the service is decent, and the interment is at St. Andrew's, and it's all over by 11, and you eat a pie at the corner standing up, same as any working day. The second funeral is in Lambeth, which means crossing the river, which means the bridge or a ferry, and Mr. Crewe has arranged for the mourners to cross Waterloo Bridge in a group at 1:30, because Waterloo Bridge is free to cross. It was free since 1878, but even before that it wasn't enormous, and there is time. Waterloo Bridge in December, fog in the afternoon. This is a thing worth pausing on. The bridge is stone, opened in 1817, one of the handsomest bridges London has, wide and columned and flanked by Doric pilasters along its parapets, and in good weather it gives you clear views of the river in both directions, the city to the east and Westminster to the west, and the ships on the water, and the whole theatre of the Thames at its busiest. Canaletto painted the view from Waterloo Bridge. People stand on it on summer evenings to watch the light. In December, fog, at 2 in the afternoon, the view from Waterloo Bridge is nothing. The parapet on your right shows you at most 15 feet of brown river water before it disappears into the fog. The south bank, which should be visible ahead, is not visible. You walk forward on faith that the bridge continues, that the south bank exists, that your destination is there, the fog so thick that the other mourners walking a few feet ahead of you are shapes without faces. Somewhere below you, the river is there. You can hear it, a cold mineral sound, the slip and pull of the current against the stone piers. You can feel the bridge vibrating very faintly under your boots with the movement of water, but you can't see it. You cross the bridge in the fog and emerge, eventually, onto the south side, and Lambeth materialises slowly around you, the buildings appearing at arm's length, and you follow the sound of the mute's wand on the cobblestones and arrive at the right address with 10 minutes to spare. The funeral in Lambeth is for a woman named Sarah Gould, a widow, 67, who was a washerwoman for 50 years and who died in a room above a laundry that she had worked in since she was 15 and that had ruined her hands and her lungs and her knees, and was ultimately responsible for her being in a box in this cold front room with a few chrysanthemums that someone had placed on the lid and that are already going over at the edges. The room smells of soap and damp and the cold of a December night that has been sitting in the walls. Sarah's daughter has hired 2 mourners. Just 2. It's all she can afford, and she said so to Mr. Crewe with a directness that he reported to you without judgment, he said. Just 2, she said, because that's what I can do. And Crewe said, 2 it is. Sarah's daughter is perhaps 40, with the same reddened hands as her mother had and her mother before her, the hands of the laundry trade. And she is crying when you arrive and still crying when you leave, and in between she stands at the graveside at Lambeth churchyard in a thin black coat that is not warm enough for December, and receives Sarah Gould, washerwoman, back to the earth. You look past her shoulder, and then, for just a moment, you don't. You look at her face. This is the thing Dolly told you never to do, and the thing you have not done, not properly, for 8 months of funerals, because Dolly was right that it breaks the performance. It makes control harder. You look at Sarah Gould's daughter in her thin coat at her mother's grave in the Lambeth cold, and you see a woman who came here alone, who had enough for 2 mourners and that is all, and who is burying the last person in the world who knew her from before any of this was possible. The thing in your chest is not the chess trick, it is something else, something the chess trick is built from, something older and less professional, and it is connected to a tin with 31 shillings and a man who hummed without knowing he was doing it and everything that has been the year since then. You do not lose control. The practice holds, the 8 months of practice, the technique Dolly built into you, the containment. But something in the performance thickens, something becomes less like performance. At the graveside in the December fog, in a thin coat, Sarah Gould's daughter looks up once and meets your eyes for a second before you look away. And in that second you're not performing for her. You're simply there, standing in the cold, present. It's enough. It might be enough. You look past her shoulder for the rest of the service, and when it is over and Mr. Crewe distributes the envelopes, you walk in silence with the other mourner, a woman called Martha who is new and still finding her feet, back to the bridge, and you cross the river in the fog, and you don't speak, and somewhere below you the Thames is moving in the dark, the same Thames it has always been, moving to the sea with everything the city gives it. On the north side, Martha goes one way and you go another, and you're alone on a December street in London in a fog so thick you can see the gas lamps burning inside their halos of light, each one surrounded by its own small circle of visibility, islands of sight in the dark grey nothing, and you walk from island to island, from lamp to lamp, heading north and east, heading home, and you think about Sarah Gould's daughter in the thin coat, and about Thomas Whitmore who worked in a mill, and about the woman who was always in Mrs. Payne's kitchen with red hands and said nothing at supper, and you think, there is so much water running through everything. There is so much water. And then you step through the door of Mrs. Payne's house and the smell of the kitchen comes up from below. Something with onions, something warm. And you take off the morning dress and hang it on the hook and wash your face and hands in the cold basin and change into your grey dress and go downstairs. The laundry woman is at the table, her hands wrapped round her mug, her face in its usual configuration of private silence. You sit down across from her and pour yourself a cup of tea from the pot on the range, and you say nothing, and she says nothing, and the kitchen is warm, and the fog presses at the windows, and the onion smell from whatever Mrs. Payne is cooking comes through from the other room. After a while the laundry woman says, "Bad one today?" You look up. Her face is still mostly neutral, mostly private, but the question is there. They're all bad in different ways, you say. She looks down at her mug, nods very slightly. I had a terrible day at the laundry, she says. Dropped a full tub, cold water everywhere, spent an hour cleaning it up. That sounds awful, you say. It was, she says, and that is more conversation than you have had with her in 3 months. You both drink your tea. The week before Christmas is the busiest week you've yet experienced, and you have a conversation with Dolly during it, at the back of a church in Bermondsey, standing in the cold of a side aisle while the family files out ahead of you. That stays with you for a long time. You've done 5 funerals since Monday. It is Thursday. Your heels are bleeding inside your boots, not the left boot which you've had repaired twice, and which fits properly now, but the right, which has developed an internal friction at the collar that raises a blister, and the blister has now been raised and reduced and raised again over the course of several days, and has given up on being a blister and simply become a raw place. And every step is a small conversation with that rawness. Your back aches from standing. The sustained slight moisture of your eyes, not full crying, just the kept readiness of the professional mourner, the eyes slightly overfilled as a matter of constant baseline maintenance, has produced a dryness and irritation in the surrounding skin that makes you look, in the cracked mirror in your room, like someone who has recently weathered a great emotional event, which you suppose is technically accurate. The headaches are permanent now. Not severe, just continuous, a background pressure that lives at the base of your skull and in the small bones above your eyes. 5 funerals in 4 days, and 2 more planned for Friday, and possibly one on Saturday morning, depending on whether the Hart family in Islington can settle among themselves on a time. The Bermondsey church empties. Dolly pulls her muffler tighter. "When did you last eat a meal?" she asks. "Tuesday evening," you say, which is not as bad as it sounds because you have been eating quickly and standing up during the day, pies and buns and chestnuts from corner vendors, the caloric intake technically sufficient if not composed in any way that could be called a meal. "Agnes," she says, and this is the first time she's used your name with that particular weight, the weight of someone who has decided something. You're running yourself through. It's Christmas, you say. Everyone's running themselves through. You're not everyone. This is not a compliment. It is a medical observation. You can hear the difference. I'll rest on Sunday, you say. You'll rest on Sunday, she repeats, with the tone of someone who has heard this before from other people and has watched it not materialize. You rest on Sunday. You sleep until the bells ring 11, and you lie in bed for another hour, not sleeping but not moving either, listening to the bells and the city and letting your body run its calculations without interference. The calculations conclude that you are tired in a way that is more than daily tiredness, a tiredness that has accumulated across several weeks, and that sleep does not quite address because it sits not in the muscles or in any specific organ, but somewhere more structural, in the way the machine is running. Mrs. Payne brings you tea and bread and dripping at 11:30, which is an act of unexpected kindness that you register in your chest differently from how you register most things. A warmth that is not the chest trick, just warmth. The letter from your mother arrives on the Monday before Christmas, and you read it sitting on the edge of the bed before you've quite finished waking up, still in the cold room, still wrapped in the blanket. She tells you that the Whitmore family has moved out of the street, Thomas's parents and his sister, gone to Bradford, she says. Something about work. She tells you that the woman who ran the lending library closed it down because her daughter came to take her to Manchester. She tells you that the winter in Salford has been mild so far, and that everyone expects it to turn terrible in January as a consequence, the mildness being generally understood as a threat rather than a gift. She tells you she hopes London is agreeing with you. She tells you to eat enough. You write back that London is agreeing with you and that you are eating enough, which is mostly true, and you tell her that you are thinking of coming back in the spring to visit, which you are thinking of, though you haven't yet looked at what it would cost. The fold of the letter is damp from your hands by the time you put it in the drawer. The last week of December produces what it always produces in this city, which is a particular state of exhaustion mixed with something else, a kind of straining brightness that London assembles at Christmas, against the dark and the cold and the fog, with candles in windows and decorated shop fronts and the smell of spiced food from the houses as you walk past in the evening, and children who are not yet managing the waiting very well, and the strange temporary quality of the days before Christmas, when everything feels like it is about to happen, and the city is holding its breath in an almost bearable way. You walk home past a church on Christmas Eve where a choir is rehearsing inside, the windows warm and yellow, and you can hear them through the stone and the glass and the December air, and you stop for a moment just to listen. The sound is clean and cold, and it reaches you without any particular professional relationship, just directly, just the way music goes in and stays in, and you stand in the dark outside the church and listen until you feel the cold through your coat. Christmas Day is free. Mr. Crewe does not arrange Christmas Day funerals. Even death is given a day off nominally. You spend it in Mrs. Payne's kitchen, which is warm, and there is a goose because Mrs. Payne has organised a kitchen supper, and everyone contributes something, and even the laundry woman, whose name you finally learned on an ordinary Tuesday in November when she simply said it. Edith, she said. My name's Edith, as if the withholding had been an oversight rather than a choice. Even Edith brings a jar of pickles and sits at the table and eats and accepts Roberts's toast, which he gives standing up in the way of a young man who's been reading too many Victorian novels and believes that standing up is the appropriate posture for significant moments. You think about Thomas. You think about last Christmas, which was your first Christmas without him, and which you spent in Bermondsey with Ruth and her tanner husband and their 2 children, all of you somewhat formal with each other, the children's loudness a buffer against the awkwardness. Last Christmas you were still in the acute phase of being a widow, still carrying the specific gravity of fresh grief. This Christmas you are carrying something else, a longer, flatter weight, the kind that distributed evenly across daily life becomes less distinguishable from daily life itself. You're becoming a Londoner. You're also becoming a woman who has made a professional study of grief and can tell the difference between types of it and stages of it, and whose tools for working with it have been honed by 47 funerals, now 48 with the Lambeth service before Christmas, and you're not sure what Thomas would make of all of this, but you suspect he would say, "Well, that pays," and then ask about the goose. The goose is good. Edith's pickles are excellent. Roberts toasts the company, and then sits down and you all eat, and the kitchen is warm, and outside London is having Christmas in its characteristic way, which is to say fully and commercially and with great noise and occasional beauty. The child's funeral is in January 14th, a Tuesday, and you know before you arrive that it is a child because Mr. Crewe told you when he briefed you, and he told you in a slightly different way than he usually briefs, slightly more matter-of-fact, slightly more precise about the practical details, as if precision about the logistics is a compensation for the thing that the logistics cannot address. He said, "The deceased is a child, 18 months, died of a croup on Thursday evening. The family's in Clerkenwell. 4 hired mourners. The procession is short. The churchyard is 2 streets from the house. The service will be brief." He said this, and there was a pause, briefer than most of his pauses, and then he gave you the card and turned to the next item in his ledger. You looked at Dolly afterward. "First one," she said. "First one," you said. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "The rule is the same. Look past the shoulder." "I know the rule." "Yes," she said, "I know you know it. The child's name is on the card. William Henry Fitch, 18 months, son of Albert and Clara Fitch of Percival Street, Clerkenwell. The name takes up more space on the card than the age or the cause, which is how it should be, how Mr. Crewe always prints them, the name largest, and you hold the card in your hand on the morning of the 14th and you say, 'William, William, 18 months. 18 months is old enough to have a name and young enough that the name is still being learned, still being applied to a person who is just beginning to know themselves as a person. And this is the specific gravity of a child's funeral, the one that is different from all the other funerals, the one that doesn't respond to the chess trick or the name as stone technique, or any of the professional machinery you have built across 8 months of practice. You know this before you arrive. Dolly told you. You know it. The house in Percival Street is narrow. 2 rooms over 2 rooms, and the front room has been cleared and the small white coffin is on the table, and it is so small. You knew it would be small. Knowing a thing does not prepare you for it. The mother, Clara Fitch, is young, perhaps 22, perhaps younger. She's standing in the front room with a woman who is probably her mother or mother-in-law, and she has the appearance of someone who's been crying for 4 days without interruption, and has arrived at a place beyond crying, a flat grey country past the border of expression, where the face simply holds what it holds and nothing more. Her husband Albert stands near the door, a young man with the hands of a working man, and the specific paralysed quality of a man who cannot fix this, and whose every muscle memory is about fixing things. The street outside has neighbours. This is Clerkenwell, not Grosvenor Square. People know each other here, and there are women on the doorstep across the road, and a man leaning against the lamppost, not quite pretending he's doing something else. A small community with a small hole in it. The procession is 4 hired mourners and the family and several neighbours who have joined, and the total is perhaps 18 or 20 people, and the white coffin is carried by 2 men, and it is the lightness of it that does something to the air around it, the way the men carry it easily, without the physical effort of a full-sized coffin, and the easiness of the carrying is the most terrible thing, the terrible arithmetic of what 18 months weighs. You look past Clara Fitch's shoulder, you hold the name, William Henry. The street is short. The walk to the churchyard takes 6 minutes. The cold is the January cold, dry and absolute. The air so still that the breath of 20 people walking together makes a collective cloud. The gate to the churchyard is iron, and you go through it and along the path to the place where the sexton has been at work, and the small grave is there, sized to what it needs to hold, and this fact, this specific, physical, accurately scaled fact about the grave, is the one that gets in under everything. The vicar's words are brief. He is a young vicar, newer to his living than to his faith, and he speaks haltingly but genuinely. And there is a verse from Matthew that you have heard at funerals before, the one about the little children, and in the context of a churchyard on a cold January morning, with a white coffin at your feet, it lands differently than it lands anywhere else. Suffer the little children. You look past the vicar's shoulder. Your chest does the thing it does, and behind the technique, a long way behind the technique, somewhere in the structure that the technique is built on top of, something shifts. Very slightly, like a house settling on its foundations in winter. Clara Fitch makes no sound at the graveside. This is worse than the sound John Dyer's daughter made in Aldgate. This is a woman so far past sound that sound is no longer available. Just the standing, just the white of the knuckles around her handkerchief, just a specific angle of a body that is holding itself upright by will alone. Because the alternative is not to stand. You do not look at her face, you follow the rule. But in your peripheral vision, at the very edge of your looked-away sight, she is there, in her insufficient January coat, and she is the mother of William Henry Fitch, 18 months, who died on a Thursday evening in a house in Clerkenwell. And the world is full of this kind of thing, has always been full of it, is running on it, and the professional apparatus for managing it and making it visible and letting the neighbours stand outside and the hired mourners walk behind is not an industry. It is not a business. It is the only thing that can be done. You understood this in an abstract way before the 14th of January. You understand it in a different way after. The kind of understanding that lives in the body rather than the mind, that you didn't choose and can't unchoose. The vicar finishes. The small coffin is lowered. Clara Fitch's mother puts an arm around her and she leans into it, and the leaning is the first fully physical thing she's done in this churchyard, and it contains everything. You walk home afterward. You walk all the way, which is almost 2 miles, because you need the cold and the movement, and you walk through Clerkenwell and into Holborn, and down toward Leather Lane, and the city is doing what the city does on a Tuesday morning in January. Everything it always does. The traffic and the vendors and the coal carts and the children running, and the factory bells from somewhere to the east, and the smell of bread from the bakery on Greville Street. And it is completely indifferent to what you've just witnessed, which is not a failing of the city, just a fact of the city. The same fact it always is. The city's scale making space for everything to happen simultaneously, and none of it cancelling out any other of it. You stop on Greville Street and buy a roll from the bakery, still warm from the oven, and you stand in the cold and eat it and look at the corner of Bleeding Heart Yard, and you think, I am good at this job. I am getting better at this job. And this job is something. It's not nothing. Dolly said that. She was right. You go into Bleeding Heart Yard and up to the preparation room and you hang up the dress and you wash your face, and Mrs. Crewe, who is at her inventory, looks up at you once with the expression of a woman who recognises something in a face without needing to be told what it is, and says, "Sit down a moment." You sit. She pours tea from a pot on the small spirit burner she keeps in the corner, because she is always in this room, And she sets the cup in front of you and she goes back to her inventory and she doesn't say anything else. And you sit and drink your tea in the preparation room that smells of camphor and black dye, surrounded by the rows of black dresses on their hooks. And the quiet is the right kind of quiet, the kind that holds something without needing to name it. After a while you say, "I'm all right." "I know," she says without looking up. You finish the tea, you put the cup down, you look at the rows of dresses. "Mrs. Crewe," you say, "how long have you been at this?" She's quiet for a moment, adding a figure to her column. 22 years, she says. "I was Mr. Crewe's first hired assistant. Then I was his bookkeeper, then his wife." She pauses. "In that order?" "And the funerals," you say. "After 22 years. She looks up. Her face is the face that presses excess expression out of itself by default, and yet something in it now is different. Just slightly. The way a very still surface of water is different when something shifts far below. "After 22 years, she says, "I know which ones to look away from." She goes back to her inventory. "You'll know too," she says, "in time." January passes. February arrives without ceremony, grey and cold and faintly resentful of its own existence. The month that is not quite winter anymore and not anywhere near spring. The month that simply occupies its calendar space and waits. The Clerkenwell funeral has deposited something in you that takes 2 or 3 weeks to settle. Not grief exactly, not anything that interferes with the work, but a kind of recalibration. A resetting of some internal instrument that has been measuring things slightly wrong and is now more accurate. What you are measuring differently is this: the value of the work. Not the 3 and 6, not the commercial value, not anything you could write in a ledger. The other value, the one that Dolly gestured at in the preparation room with her flat iron and her barely completed sentence about not being alone. The value that lives in the fact that Clara Fitch had 20 people at her son's grave in January, that she was surrounded, that the hired mourners were 4 of the 20 but not distinguishable from the rest, that William Henry Fitch's death was witnessed and attended and marked by presence, and that this is what the species does with death, this witnessing, this attendance, this refusal to let it pass unmarked, and you are part of the mechanism that makes it possible. You're getting better at knowing when this is what you're doing and when you're simply performing an elaborate visual effect for a family that wants to look well attended. Both are legitimate. Both pay 3 and 6. But they are not the same. And you can now tell the difference before the procession starts, usually from the street and the house, and the faces of the people assembling. Dolly notices the recalibration without commenting on it directly. She notices things directly only when she decides they need to be addressed. When she notices them indirectly, she says nothing, but she adjusts slightly around you, the way you adjust around a piece of furniture that has moved in a room you know well, without pointing at it. She gives you the next weeping job. Not a request, just an entry in Mr. Crewe's schedule, your name beside the abbreviation Crewe uses for weeper engagements. She has done this without consulting you, which means she has consulted with Mrs. Crewe, which means both women have decided that you are ready. You are, when you read the schedule, slightly afraid. "Dolly," you say, and she's across the preparation room examining a hem. "You'll be fine," she says, before you finish the sentence. "You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to ask if I'm sure about the weeping assignment." A pause. "Yes," you say. "You'll be fine," she says. "Start from the chest. Go deeper than usual. Don't let it run away from you. And if it does run away," she turns to face you, thread in hand, "let it. Just once. Let it run. You'll find where it goes, and then you'll know how to stop it." That doesn't sound like particularly reassuring advice, you say. It's not meant to reassure you, she says. It's meant to make you useful. She turns back to the hymn. The weeping engagement is on the first Friday of March, which is already warmer, the air beginning its tentative negotiation with spring, the light arriving a little earlier each morning and staying a little later each evening, and the city responding to this with a kind of corporate unclenching, shoulders lowering, pace changing slightly, the winter's compression beginning to release. The funeral is in Islington. A woman of 49, Margaret Ellis, who died of a tumour and who has, according to the card, one surviving child, a daughter of 23 named Harriet, who is attending the funeral from Birmingham and who arrived yesterday. The family requested a weeper because, and this is the note in Mr. Crewe's briefing that you read several times, Margaret Ellis had no other family in London, and the daughter wants her mother to have grief that equals her worth. This sentence, that the daughter wants her mother to have grief that equals her worth, is not in the briefing. You have constructed it from the facts in the briefing. No other London family, daughter coming from Birmingham, weeper specifically requested. This is what it means. Harriet Ellis wants her mother's funeral to be full. She wants it witnessed. She wants the grief to be visible and audible and real. You walk to Islington in the March morning. The air's cold still, but cleaner than February. A promising kind of cold rather than a punishing one. You have said William Henry Fitch's name this morning, in your room, before the bells rang, not as a ritual, just as a way of reminding yourself of what the chess trick is built from. What it is built from, you have decided, is not performance at all. It is the truth of the thing you're holding, just briefly, just enough. The technique is not the artifice. The technique is the way in, the scaffolding you use to reach something real, and what is real is that every one of these people existed and is now gone, and that is always true and is always worth the weight of a stone in the hand. The Islington house is narrow and clean. The coffin is in the front room, which has been arranged with the care of a daughter who arrived yesterday and worked through the evening to make her mother's house ready for this day. Fresh flowers, which are expensive in March but are here anyway, a single candle burning at each end of the coffin, the furniture pushed back to give the mourners room. Harriet Ellis is small, with her mother's face in miniature, or so you will assume, since Margaret Ellis is in the coffin and you cannot see her. Harriet has been crying since yesterday at least, and her face carries it. But she is composed when you arrive, composed in the way of a person who has decided to get through this intact and is allocating all available resources to that project. You are placed beside the coffin for the service, which is held in the front room before the procession to the churchyard, because it is small enough for this. The other hired mourner today is Pearl, who is walking mourner only and stands behind you. You are at the head of the coffin. The vicar begins. You start from the chest. You hold Margaret Ellis, 49 tumour, and you hold Harriet coming from Birmingham, and the flowers that cost too much, and the candles and the clean room and everything that is here because a daughter decided her mother was worth this. You hold William Henry's 18 months and Thomas's hands and your own mother's voice in the letter, and all of it is the same thing, which is that people are briefly here and then gone, and someone needs to stand with them at the end, and you are that someone today, for Margaret Ellis. The weeping comes from further down than usual, from the place Dolly described, and it is not controlled the way walking mourner grief is controlled. It is more present. It takes more of you. It is the sound of something being felt rather than the sound of something being performed, and the difference is not visible from the outside. If anything, from the outside, a good weeping engagement looks more controlled than an amateur's grief, because real grief often loses coherence at the edges, and a professional weeper maintains the coherence while sacrificing the containment. But the difference is audible in the quality of it, in the catch and the breath, and the way it shapes the air in the room. Harriet Ellis across the coffin looks at you once, and you know from the look that she knows, not knows that you're hired, just knows that something in this room is real, is genuinely present, is genuinely attending her mother's departure from the world. The look is a second long, and it contains an entire transaction that has nothing to do with commerce. And then she looks back at the vicar, and you look past her shoulder, and the service continues. You do not let it run away from you. The scaffolding holds, but you stand, briefly, right at the edge of where the scaffolding ends and the open air is, and you know from that edge what Dolly meant about letting it run once, because now you've seen the edge, you know where it is, and knowing where it is means you know how far you can go without going over, and that knowledge is the final piece of the professional instrument, the last calibration. You can do this. At the graveside in Islington churchyard, in the March cold, with the first tentative bird noise of the year audible from somewhere in the trees over the wall, you stand and you weep properly for Margaret Ellis, and the daughter from Birmingham stands across the grave and weeps for her mother, and for a few minutes in the middle of a Wednesday morning in a London churchyard they are not two strangers separated by the grave and by the terms of a commercial transaction. They are just two women standing in the cold, both of them present, both of them at the same grave, both of them saying, "She was here, and we were here with her, and this is what it costs, 3 shillings and 6pence, 4 and 9 for a weeping engagement." After the graveside, Harriet Ellis approaches you, which is unusual. Mostly families do not approach the hired mourners after. This is the social grace that everyone agrees to maintain, the agreement not to look too closely at the machinery. Harriet looks at you and she says, "Thank you." You remember what Dolly told you about this. Small bow, say nothing. You make the small bow. She goes back to the other family members. You walk to the omnibus stop with Pearl, who says, "First weeping?" "Yes," you say. She nods. "It shows," she says, "but not critically, just observationally." "Good or bad?" you say. "Good," she says. "The first time it always shows the good way." March continues. April comes. London greens around the edges, the trees in the squares putting out their tentative first leaves, green so bright it seems almost an overstatement against the grey. The days lengthen properly. The mornings arrive not dark but half lit, the grey turning gold earlier. And this is the thing about winter in London that you have survived. The coming through of it. The getting from the other side. You've been here nearly a year. You have in that year grieved professionally for 63 people. You know this number because Mr. Crewe keeps the ledger, and on Monday mornings you can read it over his shoulder while you wait for the week's assignments, and you have been counting since January. 63 people, 63 funerals, 63 names on 63 cards held in your hand, said in your head, carried through services and processions and gravesides. You have given each of them what you could. Not always the same thing, not always equally. Some of them got the mechanics and some of them got something more, and you know now which was which, the way you know the shape of a street you've walked 100 times. But all of them got your presence. All of them got your attendance. All of them were not alone. In April, on a clear evening that smells of the first warmth of the year, you walk out of Bleeding Heart Yard, and instead of going toward Leather Lane, you go the other way, south and then east, through Holborn and down past the great legal buildings that line the approach to Fleet Street, and down to the river. You go to the embankment, which has been finished for 3 years, which is part of the Great Bazalgette sewerage project that has built a whole new piece of London over the old tidal mud of the Thames foreshore, reclaiming ground from the river and laying it out in granite, and it is clean and wide, and the river is right there, on the other side of the parapet, going about its business. The Thames in April at evening is not the Thames you've seen from bridges or from ferrymen's boats or from the Lambeth funeral in the fog. It is the Thames in a moment of grace, the water catching the last of the day's light and giving it back orange and silver, the current visible on the surface in long smooth wrinkles that slide downstream toward the sea. There are boats, as there always are, but fewer now as the evening traffic thins and their lights are beginning to show, orange points on the water, moving with the tide. You stand at the parapet and rest your elbows on the stone and look. You've been in London for 11 months. You have made and saved, after expenses, somewhere between £2 and £3, which is not enough for anything large, but is enough for a visit home in the summer, if the fare is reasonable, if you plan. You have a dress that fits properly. You have dry boots. You have a reputation, small and quiet, in the small and quiet world of Mr. Crewe's establishment, as someone who is good at the work and getting better. You have 63 names. The river moves below you. The light goes slowly, reluctantly, the way long days go in spring, fighting the dark until the last minute, the sky holding its colour past any reasonable hour. Somewhere behind you the city's making its evening sounds, the traffic and the voices and the distant bells, but here at the parapet there is the river sound underneath all of it, the old sound, the water that has been running through this city since before there was a city to run through, carrying everything downstream, carrying the whole accumulation of London out to sea. You think about Thomas, who would have stood here and looked at the river and called it big and then looked for somewhere to get his tea. You think about your mother, who has never been to London and who never intends to come, who finds the mere idea of it somewhat alarming. You think about Dolly, who grew up in Whitechapel and can see the city from the hill at Highgate, and wonder if she left the brave one or something else, and who is, at this moment, probably somewhere in Mr. Crewe's yard, or at home with her children, or somewhere in between. You think about Clara Fitch in her insufficient coat at her son's grave. You think about Harriet Ellis from Birmingham, who bought 2 expensive flowers for her mother in March. You think about Margaret Ellis, 49, whom you wept for genuinely, the weeping a scaffolded thing that was also at its centre real. You think about 63 names on 63 cards, and the people they belong to, who were briefly here and are now not, and how the briefly here is everything, and how the not being there is everything else. The water is going to the sea. The last light leaves the sky. You push off the parapet and walk home. The thing that Dolly said in the preparation room with her flat iron, that sometimes you actually help, is more true than you knew when she said it, but it is not complete. It leaves something out. What it leaves out is what the job does to the person doing it over time, across 63 funerals, across 1 full year in a city that turns grief into industry without diminishing grief, that commercializes death without making death cheap. What the job does to you, over time, is not what you expected. You expected to become harder, calloused, the way Dolly described the body adapting, and you have in some ways. The headaches are part of the working week, accepted and managed. The heaviness of a bad funeral, the kind that follows you home, is now something you know how to carry and set down mostly, with the exception of a few that sit with you longer. The chest trick is automatic. You're not distressed by funerals in the way you were distressed by the first one, the way you stand at a graveside and feel the whole weight of someone's death pressing down. But you did not get harder in the way you expected, the way you feared when you answered Mr. Crewe's advertisement. You did not get so used to it that it stopped mattering. The matterness has shifted, compressed perhaps, distributed differently across the instrument you are using, but it has not disappeared. You are not the same person who walked into Bleeding Heart Yard in February and stood in the preparation room while Mrs. Crewe pinned a hem and tried to decide if this was a reasonable way to live. You're not harder than her. You are more accurate. You know more about grief than she did. You know it in the way a doctor knows an illness, not from the outside, but from the anatomy of it, from having had your hands in it repeatedly, from having learned which parts of it are universal and which are specific, which can be supported from outside and which have to be lived from within. You know that it matters that someone is there, that the hired mourner is not a lie told at a graveside, that the presence is real even when the grief is constructed, that constructed grief, when it is constructed well, by someone who understands what it is built from, is not separate from real grief. It is a more controlled version of the same thing. This is the thing you would tell someone if they asked you what you do and why and what it costs and what it gives. This is what you would say. Someone needs to be there. The names need to be carried. The graves need attending. And sometimes the person doing this is paid to do it. And that doesn't make them less present, it makes them more deliberate. It makes them the person who showed up and knew what they were doing and did it well. And doing something well is a form of respect, and respect is what the dead are owed and what the living owe them. That is all. That is enough. You're walking home on a spring evening in London. Your boots are dry. The air smells of coal and the river and something faintly green from the trees on Gray's Inn Road. The bells of some church you never learned the name of are striking 8, and the sound comes across the rooftops and finds you on the street, and you count the strokes from habit, because the bells have been timing your days since February, and your body has learned to listen for them the way it listens for the chess trick, automatically, underneath everything else. 8 o'clock, spring in London, alive. You go home. The room is cold because you haven't paid the coal shilling yet this week, and you put the kettle on the spirit burner, and while it heats you change out of your working clothes and into your grey dress, and you sit in the chair by the window and look at the brick wall, which is the same brick wall it has always been. That never changes, that you've looked at through every weather and every season of this year. That is familiar in the way only very ordinary things can be familiar, in the way of something you look at every day without particularly deciding to. Outside, Leather Lane makes its evening sounds. Doors and voices and footsteps and the cart that comes every Tuesday and Thursday evening from some direction you've never pinned down. Its particular rhythmic clatter on the cobbles, reliable as anything in this unreliable city. The kettle heats. You make tea. You have a letter to write to your mother, who is waiting to hear whether you are coming in the summer, and you will write it after the tea, and you will tell her, yes, you are coming in the summer, you have enough for the fair, and you will come in July, and you will stay for 2 weeks, and you will let her feed you vegetables and tell you her news, and you will sit in the kitchen you grew up in, and remember what it felt like before 31 shillings in a tin, before Bleeding Heart Yard, before 63 names. But that is July. This is April. You sit in the chair and drink your tea, and the light through the window is the last of the day's light, soft and level, and it catches the brick wall and turns it, just briefly, warm. This is the part of the day that belongs to no one but you. Not Agnes Whitmore, hired mourner. Not the widow of Thomas Whitmore. Not Mrs. Payne's lodger or Mr. Crewe's employee, or the woman with the cracked mirror room on the first floor of a house on Leather Lane, Holborn. Just Agnes, drinking tea in a chair, watching the last light change. The city murmurs outside. It never stops. You have stopped needing it to stop. Tomorrow there is a funeral at St. Giles in the Fields, a Wednesday morning, and you will be there at 8:30 in the first best dress with the jet buttons, and you will hold whatever name Mr. Crewe gives you, and you will walk behind the coffin through the streets, and you will stand at the graveside in the April cold, and you will do the work. Tonight there is just this. The tea is warm. The chair is familiar. The brick wall is doing what brick walls do, which is hold. Everything you have learned this year about grief and about the city and about what it means to be present for a stranger's death and what it means to survive your own losses and what the chess trick is and is not and what Dolly meant about not being alone. All of it is still here, in the room with you. Not as weight exactly, not as burden, but as the specific density of a person who has spent a year learning something difficult and is still in the middle of learning it and is tired and warm and alive. You close your eyes. The sounds of the city arrange themselves around you. The lane below. The distant bells of 3 different churches not quite in agreement about the time. The window against the spring wind, the spirit burner ticking as it cools. Somewhere in this city right now there are people dying. Somewhere there are graves being dug. Somewhere there are families sitting with the weight of a death that has just arrived, and the undertaker will come in the morning, and the procession will form, and the names will be written on cards. It happens every day. It happened the day you arrived, and it will happen the day you leave, and between those 2 days it has happened 63 times in your direct experience and uncountable thousands of times in the city around you, unremarked, unmarked, absorbed. You are one small mechanism in a very large machine, but the machine is not cold. It is made of people. The tea is gone. The light is gone. Outside, London is settling into its night register. The traffic thinner, the voices fewer, the particular exhausted quiet that a city achieves after the working day has finished and before the nightlife properly begins, the hour that is neither one thing nor the other, that belongs to people walking home, that belongs to the in-between. You don't move from the chair. You let the dark come in around you, the spring dark which is softer than winter dark, less absolute, still holding the memory of light somewhere behind the brick wall, somewhere past the buildings and the chimneys and the accumulated smoke of a city burning coal from morning to night in every room. Tomorrow will come soon enough. The funerals will come. The names will come. Edmund and Margaret and Sarah and William Henry, and all the names not yet written on cards, not yet placed in your hand. All the people not yet finished with their lives, who will finish them and need attending, who will need someone to stand at the graveside and carry their name as a stone and say with their presence, "This mattered, you mattered, we were here with you. You will be there, 3 shillings and 6pence, 4 and 9 for weeping. This is what it pays, and this is what it is, and these are not contradictions." You sit in the chair in the dark and let the day settle into the past tense. The day joins the other days, Edmund, Margaret, Clara, standing in her insufficient coat with her knuckles white, Harriet with her Birmingham face and her 2 expensive flowers, Dolly with her flat iron and her half-completed sentences, and her 3 years of knowing exactly how far to go before coming back, Mrs. Crewe, with her inventory and her 22 years and her cup of tea, set down in front of you without comment. All of it is behind you now. All of it is the year. You're 26 years old and you're in a room in London, and outside the city is doing what cities do, which is living and dying simultaneously, without pause, the births and the deaths and the commerce and the fog and the river running through the middle of it all, carrying everything to the sea. Your eyes are heavy. This is the part of the day when the body takes over from the mind, when the catalogue of things that happened closes itself and the need for cataloguing releases, when the chest that has been doing its professional work all day is finally allowed to simply be a chest, rising and falling, moving air in and air out, doing what it was made to do before anything was asked of it. Let the sounds come. Let the city speak its night language, the lower register, the diminished thing, the watchman somewhere far away calling the hour. Let the spring dark fill the room. Let your hands in your lap grow heavy and still. Let the faces of the day's people arrange themselves and then slowly dissolve back into the general country of everything you carry. The 63 names, the 63 stories that are not yours to keep but that are with you anyway, that have made you what you are, that are the education you didn't expect to receive when you answered an advertisement in a newsagent's window on Leather Lane. Centuries from now, this room will be something else. This street will be something else. The city will have changed so much in its surface that nothing you could point to tonight would be recognizable to a person standing here in 150 years' time. The gas lamps will be gone. The horses will be gone. The fog will be gone, or mostly gone. A Clean Air Act will eventually do what Parliament spent 50 years failing to do. The river will run cleaner. The bells you can hear right now will have been listened to by more ears than you can count. But there will still be people here. There will still be people dying, and people left behind, and people standing at graves in the cold. There will still be names on cards. There will still be the need to attend, to witness, to stand in the presence of someone's absence and say, I know you were here. Some things don't change. The human need for witnessing doesn't change. The chest where grief lives doesn't change. And the need for rest, at the end of a year that asked a great deal of you, at the end of a day that asked what days always ask, that doesn't change either. You've earned this. The chair holds you. The room holds the chair. The house holds the room. London holds the house. All of it held. All of it holding. The spring dark is soft. The bells are far away. The 63 names are quiet. Let them be quiet now. Let the work be over. Let the day be past. Let sleep come the way it came to every person you attended this year. The way it comes to the bereaved and the working and the cold and the warm and the paid mourner in her 8x10 room with the brick wall and the borrowed books and the tea gone cold. The way it comes for everyone eventually. The great equaliser. The thing that makes no distinction between the baronet in his Kensington house and the washerwoman in her room above the laundry, between the wool merchant of Grosvenor Square and the child who had 18 months. It comes for everyone. It comes for you. Let it. You've done the work. You've said the names. You were there. Good night.